to the Critical Realism Network webinar series. My name's Timothy Rotso at Yale University, and I will be the chair today for what is going to be quite the webinar. Philip Gorski, Yale University, and George Steinmetz at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, talking about ideal types and real types. It doesn't get much better than this. If you're joining us for the first time, just to give you a quick overview of what this is going to look like. Phil Gorski and George Steinmetz will be talking in a few minutes, and there'll be a chance to ask questions at the end, and we'll have a discussion between Phil Gorski and George Steinmetz about this very topic. If you want to ask a question at any point, you'll see the GoToWebinar control panel, probably on the right-hand side of your computer screen, and there'll be a drop-down tab of questions, and you can write in a question, and I will pass that on to George and Phil, and that will be that, quite frankly. Without any further ado, I will hand it over to our first presenter today, and that is George Steinmetz.
Okay, thank you, Phil, and Tim especially for organizing this, and I'll get right to it. We're going to talk today about the Weberian notion of ideal types and how it might be maybe transformed or converted or reconstructed as a notion of real types, which would be perhaps more in keeping with the philosophy of social science that Phil Gorski and I and Tim and others have been talking about on these webinars for quite a while now, critical realism. But in order to do that, Phil and I thought it might be useful to go over the background of this real type, this ideal type notion, to give people a sense of what this is and where it's coming from. So on the one hand, the notion of ideal types in the formal sense as defined by Weber and the philosophers who influenced him, according to the German sociologist Ute Gerhard, who's written an entire excellent book on the topic, are rarely used by practicing social scientists, at least in their orthodox sense. And moreover, other of the more, let's say, professional Weber scholars than I myself am have argued that the notion of ideal type is often used, or the word ideal type is often used, the phrase, as a more loosely structured synonym for something like stylized facts or even just concepts. So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about it. Still, it might be worth going back to the most influential formulation of this idea, of the ideal type briefly, and that's to be found, of course, in the work of Max Weber and of the German neo-Kantian philosopher who most deeply influenced Max Weber, Heinrich Rickert. And this is useful because in many ways the program of Rickert and Weber is compatible, I believe, with critical realism, but in other ways it is fundamentally incompatible. And it might be interesting to try and tease out those differences. Focusing then on the concept of ideal type and on that closely related concept in Weber and Rickert of the so-called historical individual, which I'll briefly talk about later, can shed a sharper light on these compatibilities and incompatibilities with critical realism and with other realisms. Weber has not yet been discussed in a lot of detail in critical realism, aside from some thinkers like Frederick Vandenberg and others, and this is partly for disciplinary reasons, I think. It's also partly due to the original orientation that critical realism had at its origin, more toward an Althusserian Marxism and British analytical philosophy and Kantian as opposed to neo-Kantian philosophy. And it's also partly for national reasons. Critical realism first emerged in the United Kingdom, not in Germany, where both Rickert and Weber's work has had the longest historical resonance. Most important, I think, is the insistence by Weber and by Rickert that their program is not an epistemological program, is an epistemological program first and foremost, and not, as in critical realism, an ontological program. And I think Phil will talk more about this in a minute. When these two thinkers use the word reality in their writing or the word realism, they're almost always referring to something that in critical realism we refer to as empiricism. In other words, they're referring to the realm of what Rickert, as a neo-Kantian philosopher, calls the empirical manifold as it is perceived by perceiving entities like us. In Rickert, then, reality, the word reality, refers not to the brute data of consciousness, but to formed material that has not yet been worked up into scientific concepts. And here I'm relying on the excellent work, the book by Guy Oakes on Rickert and Weber, that I recommend to anyone who's interested in these two thinkers and their relationship. So when Max Weber uses Rickert's term, which Rickert coined, phrase, the science of reality, or in German, the Wirklichkeitswissenschaft, to describe the historical, social, and cultural sciences, Weber is referring to a science of empirical objects. There is thus a distinctive language of reality and realism in Rickert and Weber that is, I think, closer to what CR broadly calls actualism or empiricism or empiricist realism, as opposed to the more ontological or depth realist approach that we're talking about in critical realism. Weber and Rickert explicitly reject the effort by another German philosopher, Dilthey, D-I-L-T-H-E-Y, to provide an ontological solution to the so-called demarcation problem, as Popper called it. That is, the demarcation between the natural sciences and the social sciences. For both Rickert and Weber, the distinction between natural and social sciences is an epistemological one. More specifically, Rickert argues, natural science is what he calls a science of concepts, a science that works with concepts, or he's using a term actually from Georg Simmel here, the Begriffswissenschaft, a science of concepts that abstracts from the individuality of the empirical objects that appear in our perception, and instead seeks the general laws that govern the movements of these entities. Social science in Rickert, by contrast, and in Weber as well, Weber completely agrees with this, social science cannot seek regularities, uniformities, or general laws. Instead, the objects of social science are what Rickert and Weber following him call historical individuals. In Rickert, these individuals are historical specifically because they are differentiated from simple individuals, from average individuals, insofar as they're valued universally within a given culture. Now, Weber rejects that aspect of it. That's the part of Rickert's value approach, and I'll talk about that in a moment, that Weber seems to distance himself from. But it's an interesting aspect of Weber's work that a historical individual is not any unique fact or social phenomenon, but the sorts of individuals, and he gives the examples of people like Martin Luther in German history, who are valued within that culture universally, whatever position one has vis-a-vis them. So that gives him an imminent set of criteria to derive to distinguish between historical and non-historical individuals that then become the objects of the social sciences. And I should say again that here in stating this, I'm not saying anything novel. I'm relying on the commentaries by a whole army of Weberologists who've written excellent books on this, including Hans-Henrik Brunn, Guy Oakes, Fritz Ringer, and others. In Weber, and this is one of the important shifts that Weber is seen as operating on Rickert's scheme, these historical objects are selected not because they're valued universally within a given culture, but on a more willful intervention on the part of the researcher. This is the aspect of Weber that is often singled out as one of the many slight but decisive transformations he operates on Rickert's and the other neo-Kantian scheme. I'm not going to go into that here, but I think it's another connection to CR that also marks a difference. Values are absolutely central in Weber's thinking, like Rickert's, but Weber does follow Rickert in drawing a strict line between focusing on the valuations that the historical actors one is studying as a social scientist placed on various entities, and as opposed to introjecting one's own value judgments into that historical matter. So a lot of the confusion around Weber's notion of value freedom comes from this combination of making values the very center of his sociology while restricting or putting a slight ban on or a complete ban on the introduction of one's own value judgments into that historical matter. So for Rickert and Weber, social science is inherently a cultural science in this sense, and it can provide an account of some sort of practice in relation to some value, but it can do so, they think, without taking an evaluative stance on that value. Now, all of this is going to be connected to ideal types, as we'll see in a minute. Critical realism, though, I think rejects this approach to the demarcation problem, while at the same time agreeing with Rickert and Weber on a few other things. And I just want to list a few of the places where critical realism agrees with Weber. First, both Rickert and Weber start in their, first both Rickert and Roy Bhaskar, the founder of critical realism, begin their philosophy of science with the natural sciences in order then to understand the distinctiveness of the social sciences. In other words, the starting point is an analysis of the natural sciences, and the distinctions are defined vis-a-vis that analysis. Both of them reject the idea that the social sciences are defined by the search for general laws, uniformities, or regularities, and they both insist on differences between the natural and human sciences. Both argue that social science needs to develop a completely different methodology than the natural sciences. And this is especially worked out, I think, in Rickert and Weber. According to CR, critical realism, epistemologically, social science is part of the same reality it studies. And due to what Hacking calls the looping effects between knowledge and the object of knowledge, this introduces a complexity that's less prevalent or not present at all in the natural sciences. And then, since experiments are impossible in the social sciences, a social science has to proceed by a fully different set of methodologies than does a natural science. And that's something that Bhaskar works out in the realist theory of science as compared to the possibility of naturalism. Also similar between Weber and critical realism is that critical realism sees social reality as an open system, Bhaskar's term, with a rainforest-like profusion of causal powers, Collier's term, Andrew Collier, and causal entities interacting in conjunctural and often contingent ways. This necessitates a more complex explanatory strategy than the form of abstraction that is prevalent in the natural sciences. It involves first dividing up reality, selecting out a subset of its salient aspects, then involves an explanatory strategy that is retroductive, since it's impossible to carry out experiments that hold constant all but the causal powers of interest. Retroduction is a mode of inference that subsumes another mode called abduction, in which events are explained by postulating and identifying causal mechanisms that would be capable of producing them, were they to exist, or were they to have existed in the context in question. The confirmation of those mechanisms' presence and their existence, and of the configurational nexus of different mechanisms or causes that underlie any particular historical event, involves a cycling between empirical evidence gathering and then further rounds of theory refinement and explanation refinement, and then a move back to empirical evidence. And this, according to, of course, Bhaskar's famous notion of the relativity of scientific progress, or the historicity, is a historical process that never ends. This image of the process of research and theory creation, I think, has some similarities to the vision we get in Weber. Like critical realism, both Rickert and Weber see reality as infinite. They don't use the term rainforest-like profusion or anything like that, but it's a similar notion, as endless and as impossible to survey in toto. Like critical, and this comes from Kant. Like critical realism, Weber's historical explanations of events such as the Russian revolutions or the rise of capitalism involve contingent conjunctures of causes. Unlike Rickert and Weber, however, who define the difference between natural and social science in terms of values, critical realism moves closer to Dilthey, whom Rickert rejected, in starting from a series of ontological differentiations between the natural and social science. This is what Bhaskar came to call critical naturalism. Social science is a science in the same sense as the natural sciences, but as he writes, it has salient differences grounded in a set of ontological and epistemological distinctions between nature and society. The ontological differences, just to remind you, involve, first of all, the concept dependence of social practice, and this is more or less identical to the Neo-Kantian and Weberian view of the social sciences as differing from the natural ones, insofar as its object is a world of values whose meaning needs to be interpreted and in order to be understood. For critical realism, the causal mechanisms or the powers of social science are also action dependent. In other words, they only exist in human activity, and time and space dependent. In other words, they're not universal geographically, and they're historically of shorter duration. These are also very similar to Weber, or reminiscent of Weber, who, after all, opens the conceptual introduction to his most famous book, Economy and Society, with a discussion of the concept of understanding, and then goes on to define sociology itself as, quote, a science concerning itself with the interpretive understanding of social action, and thereby with a causal explanation of its course and consequences. So for Weber, interpretation and causal explanation are linked and not separate activities. He continues, we shall speak of action insofar as an actor attaches subjective meaning to his behavior. Action is social to the extent that its subjective meaning takes account of the behavior of others. This resonates with the Bhaskarian notion of the action dependence of the causal mechanisms in social science. All of this finally brings us to the idea of the ideal type. The Weberian doctrine of value freedom seems at first glance to be diametrically opposed to critical realism's idea of explanatory critique. And I think it is. For Weber, science is neither entitled nor qualified to practice value judgments. There can be no scientific theory, according to Weber and Rickert, of morals. There is no science of morality, no science that can explain moral judgments that are correct. This is one of the biggest differences between Weber and Durkheim, but also between Weber and critical realism in different ways that hopefully Phil will be able to talk about later. There can, in Weber, of course, be a science of existing values. There can be a science of morality, but not a moral philosophy, in other words. Value spheres are central to Weber's sociology, but in Weber, these are analogous to, in other theories, things like systems and subsystems in social systems theory, or to autopoietic systems in Luhmann's sociology, or to fields in Bourdieu's sociology. These are the spheres of social life. What about concept formation? Weber here follows Neo-Kantians, Lask in particular, another major German Neo-Kantian philosopher in the late 19th century, early 20th century, in insisting on the unbridgeable hiatus, which Lask called the irrational hiatus between concepts and reality. But this is the same in Bhaskar and in critical realism. Bhaskar does not have a correspondence theory of truth, even though he's sometimes caricatured as having one. Anyone who reads it will see that he explicitly and repeatedly rejects that idea. When Rickert rejects what he calls epistemological realism, Rickert is rejecting a picture theory, he calls it, or a correspondence theory of reality, in which science provides a picture or a direct photograph or a painting or a model of reality that's an identical model, a mimicry of reality. Bhaskar completely rejects this as well. So what about ideal types? To start out, and after a moment here I'll stop, let's recall the definition of the ideal type in Weber. And this is from the Objectivity essay, which was the opening essay to the new journal that he started with others in 1904. An ideal type, he writes, is formed by the one-sided accentuation of one or more points of view and by the synthesis of a great many diffuse, discrete, more or less present, and occasionally absent concrete individual phenomena. These are arranged according to these one-sidedly emphasized viewpoints into a unified analytical construct. Weber's ideal type concept is directly based on Rickert's notion that all concepts are judgments and that all judgments are values. Values can be related to a community, as I mentioned before, but in Weber, the tendency becomes more and more, according to the specialists who've traced the evolution of his thought that I've been reading, to an individual or a smaller group of value-free scientists. as, for example, Max Weber himself. So this one-sided accentuation loses its grounding in a kind of a morally unified community and becomes more individualized or based in the scientists group themselves. The idea of the ideal type marks a key methodological difference between critical realism and Weber. And this is the reason that I and Phil are trying to propose a critical realist alternative to ideal types, something we could call real types. This could also be called a critical realist social science concept instead of a real type, but that's a bit more cumbersome. Of course, there's been massive confusion over the last century about the whole concept of the ideal type, based partly on the word ideal in that construction. And indeed, the word real is no less polysemic than the word ideal. But I think the word real has a more rigorous set of connections to critical realism in this case, and is perhaps more organically related to a wider body of thinking, and therefore may be a good starting point. Weber's methodological solution of the ideal type would differ from a critical realist position insofar as critical realism does not seek to resolve a complex event into its components through abstraction proceeding. It does seek to first resolve a complex event into its components through abstraction, proceeding from there via the process of retroduction to description of relations between these events and some underlying postulated mechanisms. In other words, abstraction is at the heart of the critical realist procedure for providing an explanation and building theory. The ideal type, by contrast, to me, seems to resolve a complex event in a different way, by willfully accentuating certain aspects that are connected to the researchers or the research community's values, rather than by seeking an abstraction at a deeper level. Real types assume an ontological disjuncture between the empirical and real levels, whereas for Rickert and Weber, this distinction doesn't even lie in reality ontologically, but is a kind of an epistemological procedure in thought, and is distinctive, in their view, to the natural sciences. Only the natural sciences proceed via abstraction in Rickert and Weber, in Rickert especially, whereas what we're talking about is a procedure of conceptual abstraction in the social sciences. Rather than seeking to identify an event's essential characteristics, the ideal type doesn't assume any ontological layering that necessitates a move from the level of events or the actual to the level of causal mechanisms or the real. One last point is that Weberian ideal types sometimes refer, in Weber's own work, to entire complex social configurations, such as, for example, the Protestant ethic or capitalism, modern capitalism or bureaucracy, but they also refer to causal structures sometimes. And so there's a bit of a confusion, at least from a critical realist standpoint, between the ontological level at which an ideal type is being placed. And of course, the confusion is not a confusion for Weber because he doesn't make that ontological distinction the same way. But I would like to propose limiting real types to causal structures. This may be one point for further discussion and possibly one where Phil Gorski and I have slightly differing views. I'm not sure. It seems to me, though, to muddy the waters a little bit to call a concept that attempts to grasp a complex, highly empirical, overdetermined entity or set of events or process, such as the French Revolution, to call that concept a real type. That seems to be a different sort of concept than the putative causes, which are more abstract and which are often invisible or the result of scientific theorizing, but not yet measurable and always visible or perceivable only in their effects. I would restrict that label to those sorts of causes that are more abstract. Now, this brings me to my last point, which is related to that, which is not a question of ontological level, empirical or real in Bhaskar's terms, but the level of abstraction which matters here. Take one last example, a completely contingent empirical event. One that we've sometimes talked about in previous webinars is a large traffic accident. A traffic accident can itself be explained by a number of more abstractable causal powers acting contingently but in concert. But a traffic accident is not itself usually a concept, a causally productive concept in the same way as those other causes. This is true even if the accident continues to have, and undoubtedly does have, a series of causal effects itself. These effects could include people fleeing the scene, calling the police, or whatever. It seems to me that if we make these kinds of distinctions, we might be led to restrict the notion of the real type to those more, somewhat more durable causes that are somewhat detachable from particular events and transportable across others, even if they never produce or rarely produce causal regularities, but are always combined contingently with other causes in producing them. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks, George.
So
let me sort of pick up a little bit where you left off, and I think what I'd like to start with is kind of recalling this passage from Weber that you cited a little bit before the conclusion of your talk. Two words that I thought were quite important there were phenomena and impose. So Weber's ideal type methodology is starting, as you rightly noted, from a particular epistemology. Indeed, his entire theoretical and methodological stance really starts from questions of epistemology, in which he's conceiving reality as phenomena, which, as you say, not sort of brute sensations, but something that's already been, to some degree, kind of worked up through the kind of different sorts of categories of our perception, and then through our particular personal value orientation, we impose some kind of order on this. So ideal types are really, as he sees this, a way of imposing some order and extracting some meaning from an extremely messy reality. And again, his understanding of theory, his understanding of method, really follow from this epistemological starting point. So again, as you rightly emphasized, critical realists don't ignore questions of epistemology, but they bracket them and typically start from questions of ontology, which is to say that the question which is first and foremost in the mind of a critical realist is not how do we know, but what do we know? In other words, what is the character of the objects of our knowledge, the objects of the knowledge of our particular science. So how do critical realists set about doing ontology? I mean, critical realists are sometimes accused of just doing kind of table thumping, I know better than you do. Reality is over here, ontology, that is, just by claiming to have some sort of special access to reality that other people don't have. A friend even sort of quipped that critical realism to him sometimes seemed like magical realism, where you sort of wave your wand and the veil falls away and reality reveals itself. I think it's true that critical realists have not been as explicit about how they do ontology as they should be, but I think it's unfair to suggest that there's no method at all. And I would suggest that the proper method for doing social ontology involves two processes. One is of a sort that Weber and Dilthey and others use, which is to think about the relationship between social science and the other sciences, the physical sciences and the biological sciences. The other, though, I think, is by means of a kind of second-order reflection on the history of the various sciences themselves. That is, thinking about the kinds of knowledge that the various sciences have actually been able to produce, and what that tells us about the kind of reality that they study, and also about the kinds of theoretical, methodological research programs that have been tried, and how and why they've fallen short. So, my own view, my own sort of reflections have led me, all in the sense of led me to what I sometimes call a kind of provisional or minimal social ontology. And the starting point for this ontology is the idea of social structure. This, again, I think is social structure. The idea of the broad concept of social structure really has been the starting point for most critical realist reflections on social ontology. It's not the only possible starting point. There are, for example, process ontologies that start with a concept of flow or process rather than with a concept of structure. But for various reasons, critical realists have typically started with the problem of structure.
What is your father's name?
And I've suggested this kind of provisional minimal social ontology that really has three basic elements, which I would call persons, symbols, and artifacts. So what I mean by this is that most social structures are complex configurations or assemblages made out of some or all of those three elements in different sorts of relations with one another. So let me now try to sort of justify that minimal social ontology using the kind of methodological procedures that I suggested. So the first one is to think about the social sciences in relationship to other sciences. So clearly, we can't talk about social structures as being purely material or physical entities. Persons are living organisms. They're not just inanimate matter. Cultures have an intersubjective dimension, which is something that partially distinguishes them from most parts of the biological world. The same holds for the place of human-made artifacts in the social world, and these things jointly are capable of stabilizing one another, and even reproducing themselves over time in particular historical configurations or social structures. So that's sort of the first. That would be the first justification that I would give, is that these are things that set social structures apart from the kinds from physical or biological structures. You can't think about a social structure just as inert matter, and you can't think about a social structure as being solely composed of a biological organism. So in this regard, different from physical or biological structures. Another way of thinking about why all three of those elements would need to be part of any kind of minimal social ontology is to think a bit about the history of social science itself. And I would argue that earlier research programs or theoretical frameworks that have tried to operate with a more parsimonious ontology have inevitably run into problems. So, for example, behaviorism tried to operate without any kind of a concept of intersubjectivity or meaning or symbols. We have various forms of extreme social constructionism, which which emphasize, of course, in a sense, the intersubjective, but tend to leave out, to treat persons as sort of blank screens onto which discourses or are inscribed. Persons not having any autonomy. I think we all are familiar with some of the shortcomings of these programs. So I could say more about this, but with this in hand, I think we can then start to think about what we would mean by a real type. So a real type is a conceptual abstraction that helps us to understand why a particular social structure or a particular class of social structures are the kinds of structures that they are and have the sorts of causal powers that they do. Which is to say that it is identifying some set of elements and interrelations which, without which those social structures would be something else and would would not have particular kinds of causal powers emergent causal powers and properties that we believe that they have. And of course, these are going to be fallible constructs. I mean, it's very possible that a particular real type that we develop might be incomplete or might be mistaken in one respect or another. And this is then something that we would have to work out methodologically by means of comparison, by means of counterfactual reasoning, by means of various forms of structural analysis, amongst other things. So that's I think a sort of a rough definition of what a real type might look like. So let me now sort of bring this basic as a sort of initial formulation of what a real type would be back to Weber himself. And reflect a little bit on how one could sort of rethink Weber's own ideal types through a real typical framework. And I'll focus here on what is arguably Weber's most famous typology, namely his tripartite distinction between the three different types of legitimate domination, namely charismatic, traditional, and rational or legal bureaucratic. I think that we can see that each of these types, in fact, at least tacitly specifies a relationship between a number of different social actors and a kind of intersubjective framework that holds those relations together. In the case of bureaucratic authority, I think we can also see that there is at least some attention to the kind of material or artifactual dimension. I mean, the idea of bureaucracy presumes the idea of the bureau or office of record keeping and so on and so forth. So there's sort of an artifactual dimension as well. So I think it would be possible to rethink all three of these types in more real typical terms. One could, of course, do this in a kind of more formal and rigorous way as well, I think, but I won't attempt to do that here. I think also that this sort of minimal social ontology that I've laid out helps us to see some of the gaps in Weber's own ideal types of legitimate domination. So in particular, I think he pays far too little attention, again, to the artifactual dimension. So just let me give one example to suggest what I mean. It seems to me that most forms of traditional authority actually do use very commonly different sorts of material symbols, different forms of material culture to represent, solidify different different degrees of social status or rank. This is, for example, one of the reasons why in medieval and early modern Europe it was very common to have sumptuary regulations. These were very complex regulations about what sorts of fabrics and designs and clothing people from various status groups were allowed to wear. All of these things seem, which seems a bit perhaps silly to us in retrospect, but was deadly serious in this period. And I think you could also, in this regard, take the shift from the shift in attire, between sort of traditional and bureaucratic forms of authority, as it's sort of indicating and demarcating a major difference there as well. So I think this minimal social ontology also gives you some critical purchase as well. So let me then sort of close my remarks by coming back a little bit to this question about values and the role of values in social science, because I think this is an area where there really is, as George emphasized, a pretty sharp difference between Weberian sociology and critical realist sociology. I think part of the problem that I would see is just in the concept of values itself. So the way that Weber thinks about values as something that's completely subjective. So values are, as it were, inside of us, and we project them or impose them on a world that is free of value, that is disenchanted, that is pliable, that is in some sense what we make it. So there is a kind of a Nietzschean or even sort of nihilistic understanding of value here at the end of the day, as something that we impose on the world, but that which is not in any sense actually in the world. I think this is actually quite problematic in a number of ways. I would personally suggest that we do away with the concept of value as a starting point for thinking about this, the issue of normativity in social science altogether. My own sort of provisional proposal would be that we, first of all, that we think about values as inherently relational, first of all, so that they involve relationships between peoples and things, between peoples and symbols. And secondly, that we think that we abandon the concept of value for a sort of a more pluralistic account of normativity. I mean, this my own thought would be to sort of build on kind of existing distinctions within the field of metaethics between, I would suggest, between the good, the just, the shared and the shared or the conventional, and this is sort of very broadly, and also I guess a fourth one would be the useful. So for the good, the just, the useful, and the shared, I think we can think about all of these things as relations. So there are certain kinds of relations between people, between people and objects, between people and symbols, which I think that which are in some sense inherently good relations. So certain kinds of food, certain kinds of friendship, good food. These are things which are inherently valuable. I think we can talk about certain social arrangements as being more or less just. I mean, certainly there are things out in the world which are more and less useful to human beings, and therefore normative in that sense. And finally, I think we can acknowledge that there are certain things which are valuable to people precisely because they're shared. Things like language, culture, which makes them useful, which makes them good, which facilitates other forms of goods, and that In this sense, what our value stances, as it were, our own personal normative commitments do, is not so much sort of organize or impose order on the randomness of phenomena as we perceive them, but actually allow us to see certain kinds of normative relationships, which are already actually out there in the world. So, in the interest of discussion, I think I'll close with that.
Well, thank you, Phil, and thank you, George. So just a reminder, if you want to ask questions now, you can go to the GoToWebinar control panel, which should be on the right-hand side of your computer screen. Go down to the questions tab, open it up, write your message, and then I'll pass it on to Phil and George. As the questions come in, I thought I might just ask a question of my own to sort of kick off the discussion. And this is around the question of interpretation within critical realism. As I sort of crudely read Weber, that one of the interesting aspects is the connection between the interpretive side and questions of understanding with the ideal typical, so that at least part of what social science is trying to do is to reconstruct a sort of idealized logic operating or that defines a particular interpretive structure or system. And he seems to then also want to take it a step further and say that the role of the social scientist in terms of any sort of public engagement, not just public engagement, is the task of clarifying that logic so that people can see the implications of their particular interpretive structures, almost as if, you know, a light bulb goes off in their head. They say, oh, okay, I see what it is that my interpretive structure leads me to believe. So my question then is in terms of thinking through ideal types and real types and interpretation, how that might fit within a sort of critical realist or a realist framework, and how taking on board some of the critical realist questions of ontology and structure and causation, that this interpretive side of Weber and social science can either be accommodated or reformed, transformed, whatever phrase we want to use.
Shall I start? So I guess one thing I would like to remind people is that the ideal type notion in Weber and Rickert really does start from an inherently interpretivist epistemology, and so in that respect, the ideal type or the methodology of the human sciences for Rickert involves really understanding the values, and we may not want to continue using the word values as Phil was suggesting, but the values of historical actors in their own terms and the kind of community of values that they were operating from. Now, there's lots of possible critiques of that. One might be, of course, and one was at the time of Rickert, how do you define the boundaries of the community? But be that as it may, and that's something that affects critical theory in general, even in the present, it was interpretive and it required that meaningful reconstruction. I think the problem, according to the literature on Weber, is a slight narrowing in his sense, not just in terms of the values being those of a more subjective sort and not the values guiding the community in which the historian, him or herself, is located, which is the second place in which values enter the ideal type for Rickert, but also a kind of a narrowing toward the default type of ideal type, or the default form of ideal type in Weber is often derived from that other set of influences that was so important for him. And he's always mediating between those two, and that was the kind of analytic economics, or the rational choice approach, as it now would be called, which plays such a role for him. So the default ideal type against which one measures, this is true after the Protestant ethic, but in economy and society, there's a bias toward those kinds of ideal types. I think that's a kind of a contingent feature of Weber's notion, though, that doesn't need to be inherent in the ideal type. But to finish up then, I think there's nothing in the ideal type notion in Weber that's hostile to, in fact, it's inherently related to the notion of an interpretive social science. But Rickert has a more complex version than Weber, because Rickert wants you to go back and interpret the collective dominant meanings of the people you're studying, and to place your own, as I understand him, place your own historical questioning within the community that you belong to. So that kind of makes it a little bit less subjective, to use Phil's terms, a little less random, and perhaps a little less Nietzschean than it becomes in Weber.
Phil, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I could just sort of very briefly speak to the place of interpretation within critical realist approaches to social science. I mean, I think it's similar to Weber in the sense that interpretations seem to be essential, unavoidable, necessary to good social science, but at the same time also insufficient, incomplete, and potentially misleading, and that to a degree which goes beyond, I think, what Weber acknowledges. So, you know, for Weber, interpretation is important insofar as if we observe, as it were, from 30,000 feet, patterns of interaction, and we try to describe those patterns in purely physical terms, the way that we might describe the motion of, I don't know, atoms in a gas chamber, that will not constitute a satisfactory sociological explanation. We also need to know something, as it were, about the inner motives or intentions that are impelling action on the ground. And so it's by combining this account of patterns or regularities of action, of observed action on the one hand, with some kind of coherent account of the driving logic or motivation, that for him constitutes a complete sociological explanation. I think more in this regard, critical realism is much closer to Durkheim or to Marx in seeing the further necessity of juxtaposing interpretive and structural forms of analysis. The difficulty is that people may misrecognize or misunderstand or be misled about what it is that they're doing, and this, you know, as for example in Durkheim's famous analysis of the social sources of religious experience in the elementary forms, or equally famously Marx's theory of the extraction of surplus value. So I think that really does mark a crucial difference, and it marks, again, I think, a crucial difference precisely because the starting point for critical realists is not is not individual action. So this, again, a sort of a fundamental difference. Critical realists think action is important. They think social structures depend on action, but they start with structure rather than action, as opposed to Weberians who are inclined to start with action and treat structure typically just as a kind of a heuristic device or a theoretical construct. So, you know, in all those ways, I think critical realists and Weberians certainly agree on the centrality of interpretation, but I think they disagree about what the relationship between interpretation and explanation.
So just a question that's come in is about perhaps further examples of ideal types. Now, Weber obviously has a few and draws on a few examples of ideal types. Charisma, patrimonialism, legal rational bureaucracy, as sort of central. Do either of you see a specific example or domain of that can help sort of articulate real types, or where this sort of real typological typical approach might be particularly helpful within social scientific explanation?
Well, one of the things I was alluding to, and then Phil also brought in another aspect of, is the fact that in Weberian, many of his examples of ideal types seem to involve the assumption of a kind of a motivational structure rooted in, complete information by the actor and a rational understanding. And in the more recent social sciences sense Weber, I think much of the talk about stylized facts or stylized motivational structures in game theoretic and rational choice theory often does have this quality, even if the word ideal type is not used, because it's the deviation from rationality that's of interest. Phil was alluding to the starting point being sort of radically depleted or radically simplified in Weber because of the starting point being individuals, and he's always seen as having a kind of an atomistic ontology in that respect as well. So I think many of the things that we're talking about in contemporary economic or rational choice theory have the quality of ideal types, even if they're not described that way. But one of Ute Gerhardt's most interesting points is the first sentence of her book on the ideal type, is that it's rarely, Weberian ideal types are rarely used. She's trying to reintroduce them into social science in this book, but I don't know, maybe Phil has some other examples post Max Weber.
Phil?
Is Phil there?
Yeah, sorry about that. Just a little audio trouble briefly here on my end. I guess what I want to do is sort of go back a little bit and clarify how ideal types or real types in social science would be different from types in other sciences. So types are also, I suppose, descriptions of kinds, or are provisional descriptions of kinds. So the question would be, how are social kinds different from physical or biological kinds? So certainly real types can't be compared, say, to the periodic table in chemistry, right? I mean, the sorts of kinds or individuals or types that we identify in the social sciences are not related with that sort of regularity. They're not, as it were, sort of permanent or enduring. We can't list them in some sort of exhaustive or nearly exhaustive, in some sort of nearly exhaustive way. I mean, they're also not kind of spatio-temporally local and exclusive in that same sense. You can have social structures that overlap with and are entangled with each other in various ways. You can have new social structures that are emerging over time, going out of existence across time. So that's all quite different from a periodical table. Maybe a better starting point for thinking about this would be some kind of genealogical table or a lineage table or evolutionary tree. I think this gets a little bit closer to what we would be up to and trying to develop real types. And so, typological constructs in the social sciences, in that sense, I think would be inherently historical, and their analysis would also necessarily be historical as well. I mean, I think this has always been, in a way, the reason why history can never really be completely disentangled from sociology, no matter how hard some people try.
Thanks, Phil. Just one more question that sort of come in is regarding the place of bias within the exam when we're talking about real types. I mean, we've sort of briefly touched on the manner in which Weber and Ricker try to situate the individual's own sort of values or interpretive system within the concept of ideal types, which is perhaps a bit more amenable, or could be argued is a bit more amenable because we're dealing with ideal typifications rather than real typifications. But how do you see bias as fitting into an account of the bias of the researcher, for example, as sitting of being within this reconstruction of types into real types, and just accounting for things like perspective and difference of perspective, different sort of biases, different accounts arising from sort of different historical locations or social structural locations. How would you try to reconcile these two points?
I would start by saying just two things. One is that the critical realist perspective is an entire framework, and this notion of real types that we're discussing here is just one component of it. And in a way, it's seeking a way to create a theory of concept formation for critical realism, just as Rickert was trying to create. His book is about, his most important book is called Concept Formation in whatever, in the sciences. And in concept formation is an important part of any scientific theory or philosophy of social science. So if we think of it that way, the concepts are only part of a greater whole, and the greater whole I briefly tried to sketch out in my comments involves this continual dialogue between concepts, concatenated concepts that are used to make sense of a complex overdetermined configuration of an event, and empirical evidence, and that cycling between evidence, concept, and explanation is one place in which bias, if bias is being introduced, and it certainly will be at various points, might be corrected, because this is not simply an individual involved in this process, but it's a group of social scientists, presumably, in dialogue. That points to the need for something else, which is a theory of sort of judgmental rationality. And Bhaskar has talked about judgmental rationality as being combined with this kind of recognition of the relativity, the epistemic relativity, he calls it, which is his word for the fact that in the actual existing history of sciences, there's a lot of stuff, a lot of transitions and a lot of theory choices that we can now see have been made for reasons other than greater correspondence with the empirical evidence. But be that as it may, as a kind of a horizon of judgmental rationality, we need to flesh out what judgmental rationality really would look like in the social sciences. And I think this is really crucial for us in the social sciences. All I can say about that now is that would be one set of answers to the question of bias. A second one, which is one that I think you get from other critical sociologies and less from Bhaskar, would be the need to build into the social science as a kind of a parallel program to every empirical analysis, a program of sort of self-reflexivity and scientific self-reflexivity within the process itself. And this is something that someone like Pierre Bourdieu has been much better at putting front and center in his work than I think the critical realists, possibly, at least Bhaskar, probably because he was less involved in these kinds of day-to-day social, scientific, empirical, historical investigations. But both a program of self-reflexivity and this kind of continual dialogue with evidence, or a cycling between evidence and theory construction and concept construction, would go part of the way, I guess, toward addressing the question of bias, without just leaving it open, as in Weber, to a semi-willful decision on the part of what concept to choose, what problem to choose to work on. Now, it should be said, though, that Weber, of course, himself also recognized that when you're actually, once you've chosen the object of analysis, he would fully agree that you would need to be completely oriented toward the empirical evidence and willing to self-correct and so on the basis of that. His bias comes in at an earlier stage in the process, presumably, or the open willingness to be biased. Again, though, I'd like to remind people that, as I understand, Rickard was not as Nietzschean about that whole point. And this is one of the places where a different strand of post-Rickartian, if I can use that word, sociology might take its cue.
Phil?
So let me jump in on this a little bit. So the idea of bias raises the question of ethos, that is, of the ethos that is proper to the social sciences. I think that this question of scientific ethos is an extremely important one, and that the concept of bias points us generally in the right direction, but I nonetheless regard it as fundamentally problematic in the sense that, again, I think it assumes that value is something that's simply inside the observer, and that attaining objectivity simply requires us to sort of silence or bracket or suppress our values, that is, to somehow still our passions and turn ourselves into kind of completely neutral kind of recording devices for factual observation. And I don't think that is quite right, or even at the end of the day, particularly helpful, because I think, in fact, that our value stances or our normative commitments actually do help us to see certain things that are actually out there in the world. So that's the question is not one really of sort of completely bracketing, as if we could just perceive facts in some wholly value neutral way, as if facts themselves were not already laden with values. I think that they are. I think that the ethos is something more. The ethos proper to social science, at least, is something different. I mean, it's more like forbearance in reaching normative conclusions or making ethical pronouncements. It is also, I think, as George kept indicating, it involves a certain kind of devotion to, even, or certainly, attention to what we observe. Also, a kind of open-mindedness. I mean, a willingness to correct, and that means not just to correct our sort of empirical conclusions, but also, I think, our sort of normative evaluations based on what we find. So, things like open-mindedness, forbearance, sort of devotion to the object. Those seem to me to be better ways of thinking about what the scientific ethos should be, and how it would differ from, say, a political ethos, than talk about value neutrality or objectivity.
I would just like to add there that even though I completely agree and with the problems with the notion of value neutrality, it is interesting that program that Phil just sketched out so nicely has a hell of a lot of resonance with some of the things that Max Weber was saying. And the idea of avoiding pronouncements from the pulpit of the academic leader is exactly one of the reasons why he was so devoted to this notion of value freedom. The idea of devotion to what we study fits very nicely with his notion of science as vocation, and the kind of necessary devotion to something that seems rather obscure. And then the open-mindedness, I think, as I was saying, I think that fits with the program of self-correction, and at least his pronouncements on particular theoretical issues at the time in the meetings of the German Sociological Society and so on. So there's a good reason to keep going back to him, in other words, other than just antiquarian interest, even if we completely, or at least the two of us, Phil and I, and probably some of the others listening, might reject the kind of radical separation between between the scientists or the sociologist's own values, or the values of the community of the scientist, and those of the object that he or she is studying.
So just building off of some of this and the discussion around sciences, and just a few things that you mentioned just now, Phil, and this is this concerns the question of progress within science. I mean, within Weber's sort of system, we can sort of see a logic of progress that's made through, abstractions or idealizations and et cetera, et cetera. How does, say, this concept of realist types fit within an account of a progressive social science? Or another way, just quite simply, does social science progress? Do we come to anything like sort of finished or completed knowledge?
Well, that's a very good question, Tim, and I think maybe this is an area where the concept of real types is actually helpful in thinking about what scientific progress would mean in the social sciences, and also how the critical realist conception of scientific progress would be rather different, I think, from the Weberian understanding. So, for Weber, recall, he talked about the social sciences as having an eternal youth, which is granted in part by the infinite manifold of social phenomena on the one hand, but also by the ever-changing value orientation of social researchers, right? So both of those, it's sort of infinity squared, if you like. I mean, for him, the social world is infinitely diverse, and it's also the case that even if it weren't, that we would constantly be bringing new questions to the same reality as our value orientation shifted. So I don't think this is how critical realists would think about it. So I think you think about progress as occurring from this perspective along a number of different dimensions. I mean, one would be better and better specifications of and differentiations between real types, better understanding of what elements and relations really are essential to a particular social structure, which give it the emergent powers and properties that it has, and which features seem to be accidental, which features differentiated from closely related social structures. And the second is progress in the sense of better and better, if you like, kind of lineage tables or evolutionary trees, where we have a deeper and deeper sense of what the branching points are between, say, different types of states, or different types of business firms, or different kinds of family structures, or different kinds of sexual hierarchies, whatever, across space and across time. And the more and more complete that inventory of the past, and the more and more adequate that description of the present, the more progress that we're making. But so at the same time, there will never be a unified field theory in the social sciences, and the reason for that is not because it would be in principle impossible because of changing value orientations. The reason is that the social system is an inherently open and evolving system, which isn't simply producing new value orientations, but is continually producing new social structures. And it's that ontological openness rather than that produces the open-endedness of the social sciences, rather than the sort of ethical pluralism or value pluralism, which produces that open-endedness.
Yeah, I would really agree with everything you just said, Phil. And I guess this does mark another sort of a difference from Weber himself, if not all the thinkers in Weber's period, is that you and I seem to be a little less pessimistic about this. I don't think Rickert was, though. It's interesting. He's called by Guy Oakes a very non-tragic thinker, and there was a turn toward that. But there is better and better knowledge of those and other social structures and processes in the past, and I think anyone who denies that may just have not taken the time to familiarize themselves with the research that's been done. And critical realism has a theory of judgmental rationality that tries to kind of correspond to what it perceives scientists and historians and cultural analysts as actually doing, as a kind of an under-laborer of the kinds of judgmental, irrational processes that may be going on. Now, that doesn't mean that it's blind to infringements on academic and scientific freedom and ideological and other forms of distortions, including bias or whatever, that are introduced to that. But as a description of what we know, I think that's a really good description. That said, the very ontology of critical realism would suggest that there will be no unified theory, and also that there will be no predictive theory, that a kind of a predictive theory, if that's the telos of a progressive science, as in the positivist dream of a unified science, that's not a plausible goal or telos for the social sciences unless they're to eliminate themselves as social sciences and just fold themselves back into the natural sciences.
Thanks, George. Thanks, Phil. Just to be honest, Phil, that last question, that brilliant question wasn't mine. It was from one of our brilliant listeners. I just feel like I should give them credit for that. One final question sort of arises from all of this is the question of public sociology. And of course, Weber saw through his work in this sense and through his engagement a sort of a duty of the academic, something like a duty of the academic to the public. And real type sort of played in that in terms of, insofar it was grounded in understanding and clarifying different positions within society and our understanding of different people. I was curious whether or what role real types might play in terms of something like public engagement, public sociology, and what place real types would have within sort of, I don't know, the concept of the social scientist as a vocation and the social scientists placed within society.
Go ahead.
Well, sure. I mean, some quick off-the-cuff reflections on that question. Maybe it would be helpful just to recall Weber's own views about how social science could contribute to public debate. Broadly speaking, he suggested two ways. One would be that it could bring clarity about means, that is, the most efficient means to achieve a given end, and the other is that it could help make various ends explicit, where ends here are thought of as and ultimate values, which can serve as the ends of action. So again, a kind of a very subjectivistic account of values. So I think that the real types again clarify some rather sharp differences here. So if we think about normativity not as something which is in our individual heads, but as something that is, as it were, baked into particular social structures, then one thing that a public sociology or a public social science could do is to clarify the different kinds of normativity or normative relationships that are baked into a particular social structure. The second thing that I think it could do possibly is to help us to think about potential conflicts between them. So let me just give a brief and possibly slightly controversial example. This is based on some book that was written about busing and integration in New York in the late 60s, early 70s. So the one way of reading opposition to integration and busing at this time was through an optic of racial justice, right, and racial power. That the resistance was motivated solely by racism. Another way of reading this that maybe takes account of a different source of the opposition, that it was about something that was shared, which is to say, a shared community, some sort of shared way of life in some of the neighborhoods that was being challenged by racial integration. And that, I think, is actually a harder kind of truth to look at. I think that in some ways that what social science can do is Weber is right that these kinds of political and ethical judgments are sufficiently complex and difficult that social scientists, qua social scientists, are not going to be any better at making those judgments than anybody else. Maybe they'll be worse at making those judgments. But one thing that social scientists can do is try to provide a more complete picture of the different things of value, of the different normative goods or whatever that are at stake in a particular decision or in a particular situation. And that, I think, that might be a way of preserving some degree of sort of scientific neutrality without completely skirting questions of valuation altogether.
Yeah, I would say one way, an aspect of that that's related might be to go back to Tim's allusion to the idea of science as a vocation and the kind of, or science as a kind of a commitment, would be to rethink the idea of the scientist as a public intellectual and the sociologist or social scientist, and and this might involve two different things. A realist type of the intellectual might be one that tries to figure out what intellectual really means these days and not what it should be or could be or has been or will be. And it may end up looking very different from what we think a public intellectual is. This is one of the points, as I take it, of the article written by Gil Ayal and Larissa Buchholz in the Annual Review of Sociology on intellectuals, that there may be completely gigantic transformations going on without us realizing it or having yet come to grips with it in our social science, of what intellectual work is and what intellectual interventions are. And presumably a public sociology, if it is still to be a sociology and not just a public political intervention, would have some connection to the scientific work that defines social science as somewhat separate from other forms of activity. The other would be something more oriented toward goals, to use the term that Phil has brought up and that Weber often uses, and this would be the idea of what could an intellectual activity of a sociologist or a public sociology be? And here, rather than drawing our ethical, moral goals of what intellectuality should be out of the thin air, I think would be interesting to go back to a long-standing discussion within critical theory as opposed to critical realism about the role of the critical social scientist or philosopher or thinker as, to use a term very resonant with Bhaskar's term of under-laborer of the social sciences, as a kind of someone helping to do the self-clarification of the struggles and the wishes of the age. That's a phrase from Nancy Fraser, who's a critical theorist. So the principles that have taken some form in the social order, but that are perhaps only imminent or emergent, could be one of the things that the social scientists could help in uncovering and making public, and could then serve as a valid basis for social critique by wider social groups. I mean, this is sort of a translation of the notion, I think, that Bourdieu very sketchily put forward of the collective intellectual. That collective intellectual might be someone involved in that kind of collective critical theory in the interest of some form of critique that's emergent but not yet fully clarified. That's pretty vague, but I mean, that's not vague, that's pretty general, but I think that's also helpful as opposed to, you know, the more arbitrary notion of a public intellectual or a public sociology is anything that I want it to be because I believe in that goal. That to me resonates a lot with Weber's somewhat arbitrary value orientation in his own work that Phil earlier labeled Nietzschean.
Thank you, George and Phil. That was really helpful. We are out of time. There are some questions left that we're unfortunately not going to be able to get to today. But if I can impose on Phil and George, I might ask that you are able to respond to them in a sort of written format that we can place on our blog, because the questions are quite good and helpful in further clarifying some of this discussion. Otherwise, thank you, Phil, thank you, George, for taking some time to discuss this, and thank you for everybody who has tuned in to listen to us. I would just like to point out a few things. This will be a final webinar for the year, and we will be looking to start up a webinar series again next year. But what I do want to highlight in the meantime is George is now is currently at Princeton University as a visiting faculty in the Institute for Advanced Studies, and if you go onto the website, you will see that they run a social science seminar every Monday within the sort of broader theme of social sciences in a changing world. And I'd recommend looking at those and attending. They over the next couple of weeks and until the end of the year, there are some very, very interesting, presentations coming up. Otherwise, if you haven't yet subscribed to our Facebook group or to our Twitter feed, we would encourage you to do that. And all the past webinar recordings are available online through our website. So please do check that out, and keep an eye out for upcoming events and webinars in the near future. So thank you, and we hope to see or hear from you soon.